For the vast majority of human history, we're talking well over 300,000 years. Our ancestors lived without anything resembling modern medicine. No hospitals, no surgery as we'd recognize it, no germ theory, no antibiotics, and their world was violent. Not necessarily in the sense of constant warfare, though that certainly happened, but in the sense that daily survival was physically brutal. Hunting large animals with spears made of wood and stone meant getting close enough to be gored, trampled, or clawed. Climbing for food, crossing rivers, escaping predators, giving birth, foraging on cliffs and rocky terrain. Every single one of these ordinary activities carried a real risk of serious injury. Add to that intergroup conflict occasional accidents like falls or burns, and the simple wear and tear of a physically demanding life, and you start to understand why anthropologists who study ancient skeletons find so much evidence of trauma. Broken bones, skull fractures, puncture wounds, dislocated joints. It's everywhere in the fossil record. Here's the thing that surprises most people, though. A broken leg or a serious wound in the ancient world wasn't automatically fatal. In fact, the evidence shows something remarkable. Many of these injuries healed, and healing doesn't happen by accident. Healing, especially from a severe injury, requires care. Let's talk about one of the most famous cases in paleoanthropology, a Neanderthal skeleton known as Shanidar 1, discovered in a cave in northern Iraq. This individual, who lived somewhere between 45,000 and 35,000 years ago, is a walking case study in trauma survival. His skeleton shows a withered right arm, likely amputated or rendered useless well before death. He had a healed skull fracture. He had signs of significant hearing loss. And researchers even believe he may have had limited use of one leg. Now here's the part that stops people in their tracks. Based on the state of his bones, scientists estimate this man lived for years, possibly a decade or more after suffering these injuries. In a world with no modern medicine, a one-armed, partially blind, partially deaf Neanderthal survived long-term. How is that even possible? He could not have hunted effectively. He likely could not have defended himself in a fight. He would have struggled to travel long distances, to forage, to do many of the basic tasks required to survive in a hunter-gatherer band, which means someone, his community, carried the slack. They fed him, they protected him, they allowed him, despite his disabilities, to remain part of the group instead of leaving him behind. This is one of the most cited pieces of evidence in all of anthropology for compassion and social care among archaic humans, and it fundamentally changed how scientists thought about Neanderthals, who were once portrayed as brutish and animalistic. And Shanidar 1 is not alone. Across dozens of Neanderthal and early Homo sapiens sites, researchers have documented an astonishing pattern of healed trauma. Take the Neanderthal skeleton from La Chapelle-aux-Saints in France, an older individual with severe arthritis, tooth loss, and evidence of a healed jaw injury, who would have needed his food prepared differently, possibly even pre-chewed or softened by others, in order to survive. Or consider the many Neanderthal skeletons showing healed rib fractures, a common injury pattern that some researchers have compared to the trauma seen in modern rodeo performers, consistent with the idea that Neanderthals hunted large, dangerous animals at extremely close range, using thrusting spears rather than long-range projectile weapons. That means close combat with megafauna like woolly rhinos, bison, and cave bears. Injuries were not the exception in this lifestyle, they were the expectation. What's remarkable is the rate of healing found in the fossil record. In study after study, researchers find that a huge percentage of detected fractures show clear signs of bone remodeling, meaning the person didn't just survive the initial injury, but lived long enough afterward for the bone to knit back together. That process alone can take many weeks for a simple fracture and months for a severe one. Surviving that window in a world of predators, cold, and limited food security was no small thing. This same pattern shows up in early Homo sapiens skeletons too. There are documented cases of individuals with healed skull trauma, healed limb fractures, and even evidence of amputations that appear to predate written history by tens of thousands of years. One of the most stunning examples comes from a cave in Borneo, where archaeologists discovered the skeleton of a young person who lived roughly 31,000 years ago and had part of their lower left leg surgically amputated, likely due to a childhood injury. The bone had healed cleanly, and the individual is believed to have survived for 6 to 9 more years after the procedure. This find pushed back the earliest known evidence of surgical amputation by tens of thousands of years, and it strongly suggests that whoever performed this operation understood anatomy, infection risk, and wound care well enough to prevent this small child from bleeding to death or dying of sepsis. Let that sink in. Prehistoric people without metal scalpels, without antiseptics, without any of the tools we associate with surgery, successfully amputated a limb from a living child and kept that child alive afterward. So the next question is obvious. How did they actually do it? This is where things get genuinely fascinating, because the evidence suggests ancient humans weren't just passively surviving injuries, they were actively treating them. Even without understanding germs, early humans clearly grasped that dirty wounds behave differently than clean ones. Ethnographic studies of modern hunter-gatherer societies, groups that still live in ways broadly similar to our ancient ancestors, show consistent use of substances like ash, certain plant resins, clays, and even chewed plant material to pack and cover wounds. Many of these substances have genuine antimicrobial properties. Honey, for example, has been used across cultures for thousands of years to treat wounds, and modern science has confirmed it really does have antibacterial effects, in part because of its low water content and mild acidity. We have direct fossil evidence that Neanderthals used medicinal plants. Dental plaque recovered from Neanderthal remains. Yes, scientists can extract and analyze ancient dental plaque, has revealed traces of plants with known pain-relieving and antibiotic properties, including compounds similar to those found in modern aspirin, and even traces of a mold related to penicillin. This doesn't necessarily mean Neanderthals understood why these plants worked, but it strongly suggests generations of trial and error had taught them which ones helped. Several healed fractures in the fossil record show a straightness and alignment that will be very unlikely without some form of splinting or deliberate immobilization. A badly broken bone left completely untreated tends to heal crooked, sometimes dramatically so. Yet many ancient specimens show fractures that healed in near-perfect alignment, suggesting the injured limb was stabilized, perhaps wrapped, bound to a stick, or kept still while it healed. Perhaps the most jaw-dropping evidence of ancient medical intervention is trepanation, the practice of drilling, cutting, or scraping a hole into the skull. This wasn't rare. Thousands of trepanned skulls have been found across the world, from Neolithic Europe to ancient Peru, some dating back over 7,000 years. Why would ancient people do this? Theories vary. Treating head trauma, relieving pressure from skull fractures, treating seizures, or even for spiritual or ritual reasons. But here's the part that matters most for our story. A huge percentage of these skulls show clear bone regrowth around the edges of the hole, meaning the patient survived the surgery, sometimes for years afterward. And in some documented cases, people underwent the procedure multiple times and survived each one. Think about what that means. Someone thousands of years before germ theory or anesthesia, as we know it, was performing skull surgery on a conscious human being and doing it well enough and cleanly enough that the patient lived. There's also evidence, particularly from later prehistoric and early historic periods, of deliberately set fractures, wooden splints preserved in burial contexts, and even primitive prosthetic devices. One of the most famous is the Cairo toe, an artificial big toe made of wood and leather found on an ancient Egyptian mummy, dated to around 950 to 710 BCE, which shows signs of wear consistent with actual use while walking, not just for burial appearance. While that example is more recent than the Paleolithic cases we've discussed, it shows the through line. Humans have been engineering solutions to physical injury and disability for an extraordinarily long time, far longer than most people assume. Here's where we zoom out and ask the bigger question: why does any of this matter? Because it fundamentally reframes what we think prehistoric life was actually like. For a long time, popular imagination, shaped heavily by outdated, savage caveman stereotypes, pictured early human life as a ruthless free-for-all where the injured and weak were abandoned and only the fittest survived. It's an idea rooted in a kind of oversimplified take on natural selection. Nature is cruel, so early humans must have been too. But the archaeological record tells a very different story. Time and again we find skeletons of individuals who could not possibly have survived on their own. People with amputated limbs, blindness, severe arthritis or paralysis, who nonetheless lived for years within their communities. This means resources were being shared with people who could no longer earn their keep in a purely economic sense. It means individuals were being carried physically and socially by the group around them. Some researchers argue this changes how we should think about the evolutionary role of compassion itself. Care for the sick and injured isn't some late invention of civilization. It appears to be baked deep into the story of what made humans, and possibly Neanderthals too, successful as a species. A group that cares for its wounded retains knowledge, skill, and social bonds that a group which abandons its wounded would lose. An older injured hunter who can no longer chase game might still be the single best toolmaker in the band, or the one who remembers where water can be found during a drought, or the one who knows which plants are poisonous. Survival of the injured wasn't just an act of kindness, it was, in a very real sense, a survival strategy for the whole group. This is sometimes referred to by researchers as an early form of what's now called the bioarchaeology of care, a field that specifically studies skeletal evidence for disability and the social support that must have accompanied it. And what it reveals, over and over again, is that vulnerability and community support have been intertwined in the human story for an extraordinarily long time, likely stretching back before Homo sapiens even existed as a species, given that we see this pattern clearly in Neanderthals as well. Now, to be balanced here, this isn't a story where every injury had a hopeful outcome. For every healed fracture we find, there are likely many, many more injuries that simply killed the person outright or led to fatal infection before healing could occur. Survivorship bias plays a role in what we find. The skeletons we recover and study are, by definition, the ones that survived long enough to leave lasting evidence. Infection was an enormous and largely uncontrollable threat. Without antibiotics, even a relatively minor wound could turn deadly if it became infected. Something we sometimes forget in the modern world, where a scraped knee is a non-event, but for most of human history could plausibly be fatal. Childbirth was staggeringly dangerous for both mother and infant. Broken bones that didn't heal properly could lead to lifelong disability, chronic pain, or secondary complications like reduced mobility, which in turn made a person more vulnerable to future injury or predation. So it's important not to romanticize this too much. Ancient humans were not walking around with some kind of secret advanced medical system that rivaled a modern ER. What they had was something more modest but still remarkable. Real, working medical knowledge built up and passed down over countless generations through observation and trial and error, combined with, critically, a willingness to care for each other even when it came at a real cost. So, what actually happened when ancient humans got injured? The honest answer is, it depended enormously on the injury, the individual, and the group around them. Some injuries were fatal, full stop, there was no getting around the absence of modern trauma medicine. But an astonishing number of injuries that we would consider severe, even by today's standards, compound fractures, skull trauma, amputations, were survived. Not through luck alone, but through active intervention, wound care, herbal remedies, splinting, and in some truly remarkable cases, surgery. And behind every one of those healed bones is an unspoken story of other people. Someone who fed a man who could no longer hunt. Someone who kept a child alive after amputating part of their leg. Someone who packed a wound with the right plant, learned from someone else, who learned it from someone before them. In other words, when we ask what happened when ancient humans got injured, the deepest answer isn't really about broken bones at all. It's about the people who didn't leave. Long before hospitals, before written language, before anything we'd recognize as civilization, humans were already showing up for each other in their most vulnerable moments. That, more than any spear point or stone tool, might be the most important thing our ancestors ever passed down to us. If you found this as fascinating as I did, let me know in the comments. And if you want more deep dives into the hidden history of how ancient humans actually lived, hit subscribe because we've got a lot more of these stories coming. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.